I stood in the glass-walled conference room, watching my team settle into their chairs. We had spent 6 months developing this project, real work, real passion, real results. My hands felt steady as I waited for Martin to arrive. He walked in with his nephew Tyler beside him, both of them smiling in that same confident way. I noticed something was off about their energy, but I didn't say anything. Martin cleared his throat and announced that the project was being restructured. My stomach dropped, but I kept my face neutral. He handed the folder to Tyler, calling it a fresh leadership opportunity. The team clapped awkwardly, unsure what they were really celebrating. Martin turned to me without hesitation. "You'll assist Tyler during the transition." That single sentence changed everything. I felt my hand tremble against the table, but I held it there, refusing to let anyone see me shake. Martin didn't even look at me as he spoke. He simply moved on to the next item on his agenda, as if removing me from my own project required no more effort than ordering coffee. My colleagues exchanged uncomfortable glances. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting for a reaction. Instead, I smiled calmly and nodded, as if I understood completely. As if this made perfect sense. "My name is Avery Cole. That's what my badge said at Larkin Dynamics. That's what everyone called me. But my real name was Avery Cole Larkin, and nobody at the company knew that. I wasn't just another employee trying to climb the corporate ladder. I was the daughter of Charles Larkin, the founder of the entire company. I owned 41% of the company, the majority stake. But nobody knew this because I had specifically asked my father to keep it secret. Growing up, my father had taught me something important: real power doesn't announce itself. Real power watches and listens and learns. He had built Larkin Dynamics from nothing, turning it into one of the most respected companies in the industry. When I turned 21, I told him I wanted to work there, but under my own name. I wanted to earn my position through my own efforts, not because of my last name. My father had agreed, though I could see the worry in his eyes. That morning, I walked into Larkin Dynamics with my head held high, ready to prove myself. I started as an intern, just like anyone else. Over the years, I worked my way up through dedication and intelligence. My colleagues respected me because I earned their respect through hard work. Nobody suspected that the quiet woman in the corner office was actually the boss's daughter. Nobody suspected I was the majority shareholder. That was exactly how I wanted it. Tyler's first team meeting was a disaster from the start. He sat at the head of the conference table like he had been born to the position, but he had no idea what he was doing. I watched as he shuffled through his notes, mispronouncing technical terms and fumbling through slides that I had created weeks ago. "Can someone explain what this means?" he asked, pointing at a section of code. I started to answer, but Martin cut me off immediately. "Let Tyler handle this," he said sharply. "He's in charge now." The words stung more than I expected. My colleague stared at the table, uncomfortable. Tyler stumbled through an explanation that was completely wrong. I watched the team's confidence in him drop with every sentence. They kept looking at me, silently asking why I wasn't correcting him. But I stayed silent. When Tyler made a critical error about budget projections, I felt my stomach twist. This would cost the company thousands if nobody fixed it. My hands clenched into fists under the table, but I forced myself to breathe slowly. I couldn't say anything. Martin would shut me down again. The meeting ended badly. Tyler looked confused and frustrated. Martin looked satisfied, as if he had somehow won something. I excused myself to the bathroom and locked the door behind me. For a moment, just a moment, I let myself break. I gripped the sink so hard my knuckles turned white. Tears tried to come, but I forced them back. I looked at myself in the mirror. My reflection looked strong, even if I didn't feel strong. I took a deep breath and whispered to myself, "Not now. Not yet." I decided to stay at the company instead of quitting immediately. Some people thought I was being weak, accepting this humiliation. But I knew something they didn't. I had my own plan. My colleagues whispered about the unfairness of the situation. They complained in the break room and sent me supportive messages. I thanked them but remained composed in public. I showed up to work on time, did my job with excellence, and never complained. Martin seemed to feel victorious over my silence. Tyler believed he had truly earned the position through his own skills. That night, I wrote a single sentence in my planner: don't react. Observe. I underlined it twice. I was going to watch everything. I was going to document everything. And when the time was right, I would act. I pulled out my father's photo from my desk drawer. We had taken it together at a cabin in Montana years ago. Both of us were smiling, but there was something serious in our eyes too. I remembered sitting with him after a difficult board meeting when I was younger. A hostile investor had tried to manipulate the company's future. My father had handled it perfectly. He never yelled. He never rushed. He simply listened and observed until he understood exactly what the investor wanted. Then he had quietly moved pieces around the board until the investor had no power left. I closed the photo frame gently and placed it back on my desk. A small smile formed on my face. My father had always told me that power doesn't shout. Power watches. Power collects. I thought back to a lesson my father had taught me when I was much younger. We had been sitting in his office late one evening, watching the sunset from the huge windows. A hostile board meeting had just ended, and I had been angry about how roughly the other board members had treated him. "Why didn't you fight back?" I had asked him, frustrated. He had smiled and put his hand on my shoulder. "Power doesn't shout, Avery," he had said calmly. "It watches. It collects. The man who loses his temper loses control of the situation. The man who stays calm collects information." I had asked him what he meant. He had explained that while the other board members were shouting and demanding things, he was learning exactly how they thought. He was discovering their weaknesses and their fears. He was building a strategy based on what he had learned about them. By next month, he had told me, that board member won't have any power left. But he won't know it was me who took it from him. Looking back now at the present situation, I understood exactly what he meant. I needed to stay calm. I needed to watch Martin and Tyler closely. I needed to collect information about what they were doing and how they were doing it. As I sat at my desk pretending to work on Tyler's assignments, a new determination filled me. This wasn't about being angry anymore. This was about being strategic. This was about using my intelligence and patience to fix what was broken. I began quietly building my network within the company. I had always been friendly with people, but now I approached it differently. I started having lunch with the HR manager, Jessica. I asked her about company policies and listened carefully to her concerns about management. I began chatting with the IT specialist, Marcus, about data security and company systems. I even befriended Thomas, the janitor who had worked at Larkin Dynamics for 15 years. Thomas noticed everything that happened in the building. He saw which executives stayed late and which ones left early. He noticed unusual activity in offices and overheard conversations in hallways. Over coffee, I learned that Thomas had seen Martin having private meetings with contractors outside the company. These small connections started to create a picture like roots growing underground. My network expanded slowly but steadily. I wasn't asking anyone to help me directly. I was simply listening, learning, and collecting information. One day, Claire, one of our senior engineers, approached me privately. She looked nervous and kept glancing around to make sure nobody was watching. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. I nodded and followed her to an empty conference room. Claire explained that she had noticed financial irregularities in the department budget. Money was disappearing in ways that didn't make sense on paper. She was worried about reporting it to Martin because he seemed involved somehow. She had come to me because she trusted me and knew I was smart enough to understand what was happening. This was exactly the kind of information I had been waiting for. I told Claire that I would help her investigate carefully. We agreed to meet regularly in private to discuss what we found. The next quarterly review meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon. Martin stood in front of the entire department and announced Tyler's promotion to permanent leadership. My colleagues clapped politely, though I could see the doubt in their faces. Tyler beamed with pride, convinced he had finally proven himself. I clapped along with everyone else. My face showed genuine celebration, but my eyes were fixed on the accounting sheet sitting in my folder. I had been studying our department's financial records carefully over the past weeks, thanks to help from the finance team who had become friendly with me. I had found something disturbing: unauthorized fund reallocations signed by Martin. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been moved from our department budget to accounts that didn't exist in our normal operational structure. The money trail led directly to Martin's personal consulting accounts. He was embezzling from the company. My father's company. His company. Our company. The thought made my blood run cold. This wasn't just about Martin being unfair to me. This was about him stealing from the organization itself. He was committing fraud. I knew that I finally had real evidence of actual crimes. That evening, I called my father. He had been asking me how things were going at work. I had been lying to him, telling him everything was fine. This time, I almost told him the truth. But something stopped me. I wasn't ready to reveal myself yet. "Everything's fine, Dad," I said, keeping my voice steady. He reminded me that the company carried our family name. He told me to remember who I was. The weight of his words settled on my shoulders like a heavy coat. Claire and I began working together more openly now, though we were always careful about who saw us together. She had access to different financial records than I did, and together we could see the complete picture of what Martin had been doing. We collected evidence piece by piece. We gathered emails, transaction records, meeting notes, and anything else we could find. We never stole anything or broke any rules. We simply used the information that was available to us through our normal jobs. Claire was tired of watching corruption happen without anyone stopping it. She wanted to help me expose the truth, though she still didn't know who I really was. I never told her that I was the majority shareholder. I never told her about my father or my last name. As far as Claire knew, I was simply another employee who cared about the company's integrity. We discovered that Tyler had been helping Martin by creating false project reports. The money that Martin was stealing was being hidden under Tyler's fake project expenses. Tyler probably didn't understand what he was doing. He was just following Martin's instructions, proud to be working so closely with his uncle. The scale of the theft shocked me. Martin had stolen nearly $2 million over the past 3 years. He had been planning to continue the scheme for years more. If I hadn't stayed at the company and investigated, this could have destroyed everything my father had built. I thought about my father working hard to build this company from nothing. I thought about all the employees who worked honestly every single day. I thought about how Martin had betrayed all of them. One evening, my father called me from Montana, where he spent most of his time now. He had retired from daily operations but still owned the company through his stake. I answered the phone quickly, hoping to sound normal. "How's my daughter doing?" he asked warmly. "Are you still enjoying work at Larkin Dynamics?" I wanted to tell him everything right then. I wanted to explain about Martin and Tyler and the fraud. I wanted to ask for his advice. But something inside me held back. I hesitated for a moment too long, and he noticed. "Avery? Is everything okay?" His tone changed to concern. "Everything's fine, Dad," I lied smoothly. "Work is good. I'm learning a lot." He seemed satisfied with that answer. Before we hung up, he reminded me of something that he had told me many times before. "Remember who you are, Avery," he said seriously. "The company carries our name. Whatever you do, make sure it reflects who we are." His words hit me harder than he knew. I was going to expose the truth about what was happening at our company. But I was going to do it the right way, with evidence and procedure and justice. I wasn't going to do it out of anger or revenge. I was going to do it because it was right. After I hung up the phone, I sat in my apartment for a long time, thinking. I looked at the framed photo of my father on my shelf. I looked at the evidence I had been collecting, all organized carefully in my laptop files. I was ready. I just needed to wait for the right moment. The moment came 2 weeks later, and it was worse than I expected. Tyler's incompetence had caused a major delay on a client project. The delay was going to cost the company millions of dollars in penalties and lost business. The client was furious. The entire company was in crisis mode. Martin called an emergency board briefing to explain what had happened. I was there, of course. I sat in the back of the conference room, trying to be invisible. Martin stood at the front and blamed me for the failure. Avery failed to properly manage the transition to Tyler's leadership, he said coldly. Her incompetence as a junior supervisor caused this catastrophe. His words hit me like physical blows. The lie was so obvious, so unfair, so complete. Everyone in the room knew that I hadn't been involved in any decisions since Tyler took over. Everyone knew that Tyler had made the critical mistakes. But nobody said anything. They were all afraid of Martin. I felt humiliation wash over me. I was being publicly blamed for work I hadn't even done, by a man who was stealing from the company. My face burned with the injustice of it. I wanted to stand up and scream the truth right there in that moment. But I didn't. Instead, I excused myself quietly and went back to my desk. I began packing my personal items into a box. A few colleagues stopped by to ask if I was quitting. I told them I wasn't sure yet. As I packed, I whispered to myself, "Okay, Martin. You just wrote your own ending." I was done waiting. I was done being patient. It was time to act. That night, I laid out my complete counterattack strategy. I wrote it all down in a private document, organized by steps and timelines. I had the evidence. I had the witnesses. I had the network. Now I just needed to execute the plan perfectly. First, I would connect quietly with the internal audit team. They had authority to investigate financial irregularities within the company. I would submit anonymous reports backed by concrete proof. The evidence was so solid that they wouldn't be able to ignore it. Second, I would work with Claire to seed additional information in strategic places. We would leave hints that would lead the audit team in the right direction. We would make sure they found everything. Third, would not participate directly in the investigation. I needed to remain invisible and protected. If Martin discovered that I was the one who had reported him, he might try to destroy evidence or threaten me or worse. Fourth, I would wait for the evidence to speak for itself. Once the audit team discovered the fraud, the company's leadership would have to act. I knew this strategy was strong because it didn't rely on anyone believing me or taking my word. It relied on facts and documentation. It relied on evidence that couldn't be denied or explained away. I spent the entire night organizing my evidence into clean, professional reports. I prepared everything the audit team would need to understand what Martin had done. I included dates, amounts, signatures, and explanations for every single transaction. By morning, I was ready. Over the next 2 weeks, strange rumors began spreading through the office. Whispers about missing budgets. Mentions of leaked emails that nobody could explain. Questions about untraceable invoices that appeared in the financial records. Martin started snapping at staff members over small things. He seemed stressed and distracted. Tyler looked nervous and confused. Neither of them understood what was happening or where the information was coming from. I remained invisible through it all. I was polite and professional. I arrived to work on time, did my job well, and kept my head down. Nobody suspected me. Nobody even looked at me when people started discussing the mysterious rumors. The finance team members I had befriended started asking me careful questions. I answered honestly but without volunteering extra information. When they asked if I had noticed anything unusual about the budget, I simply said that I had seen some confusion in the records but nothing that I could explain personally. The HR department received several anonymous reports about potential financial fraud. The reports came from me, submitted through secure channels that couldn't be traced back to my personal accounts. Each report included documentation and specific details. Slowly, the pressure began building on Martin. He didn't know where the information was coming from. He didn't know who was investigating him. He just knew that his world was starting to crack. One morning, I overheard him in his office on the phone. He was talking to someone about making changes to financial records and covering up discrepancies. The panic in his voice was unmistakable. Martin confronted me privately one afternoon. He called me into his office and closed the door firmly behind me. His eyes were hard and suspicious. "I know something's going on," he said, his voice low and threatening. I know people are talking about financial irregularities. I know you're somehow involved. I looked him dead in the eye. I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I'm not the one who's afraid of being found out, I said calmly and clearly. For a moment, he just stared at me. He seemed to be searching my face for signs of deception. Then he laughed, but it was a nervous laugh that didn't reach his eyes. The sound of my words seemed to haunt him even as he tried to dismiss them. You know, he said, leaning back in his chair, you should be more careful about making accusations. That's exactly the kind of thing that could get someone in serious trouble. It was a threat, but a weak one. He was scared. He didn't have proof that I was involved in anything. He just knew that something was wrong, and his instincts were pointing toward me. I stood up to leave. Is there anything else? I asked politely. He waved me away without responding. I left his office feeling stronger than I had in weeks. He was rattled. He was worried. He was starting to panic. The noose was tightening around him, and he didn't even understand who was pulling the rope. Claire and I began securing key witnesses who could testify about what they had seen. We worked carefully and quietly, never revealing that we were gathering evidence for any specific purpose. We simply had conversations and listened to what people had to say. Jessica from HR remembered numerous instances of unusual financial meetings. Marcus from IT had logs of unusual file access and data transfers. Thomas the janitor had seen Martin meeting with outside contractors in parking lots and empty hallways. We scheduled what we called a routine presentation for the internal review team. On the surface, it was just another department update. In reality, it was a silent strike disguised as ordinary protocol. We had organized all of our evidence into a clear, professional presentation. We weren't going to make accusations. We weren't going to point fingers. We were simply going to present facts and let the leadership team reach their own conclusions. Everything was ready. Every piece of evidence was in place. Every witness was prepared. Every document was organized and authenticated. I felt calm as I reviewed the presentation one final time. This wasn't rage anymore. This wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. This was about protecting the company my father had built. This was about protecting my colleagues who deserved to work in an honest environment. I thought about my father's words, power doesn't shout. Power watches. Power collects. I had done exactly that. I had watched and collected, and now I was about to act. The night before the presentation, I sat in my car in the parking lot outside my apartment. The sound of rain on the windshield matched the rhythm of my heartbeat. I was nervous but not frightened. I was ready but not eager. This was necessary, and I accepted that. I rehearsed what I would say if anyone asked me questions during the presentation. I went through different scenarios in my mind. What if Martin denied everything? What if Tyler tried to blame me? What if the evidence wasn't enough? But each time I reviewed the facts, I knew I was prepared. The evidence was solid. The documentation was complete. The witnesses were credible. This was going to work. I thought about all the times Martin had dismissed me in front of my team. I thought about being blamed for his nephew's failures. I thought about the humiliation of being removed from my own project. But I didn't think about those things with anger anymore. I thought about them as facts that had led me to this moment. They were the path that had brought me here, ready to expose the truth. I turned on the car and drove home slowly through the rain. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, the truth would come out. Tomorrow, justice would be served. But tonight, I was simply going to rest and prepare myself for what was coming. The audit meeting took place in the main conference room at 10 o'clock in the morning. The internal review team was there, along with several board members. Martin and Tyler sat on one side of the table. I sat on the other side, next to Claire. Claire presented the financial information first. She walked through the budget records, showing how money had been moved and reallocated over the 3-year period. She didn't accuse anyone directly. She simply presented the numbers and asked whether these transactions followed company policy. Then I presented the documentation. I showed the emails, the signatures, the consulting accounts. I showed the timeline of when the money had been moved. I showed the connection between the missing funds and the false projects that Tyler had created. The room was silent as the evidence mounted. Martin's face grew increasingly pale. Tyler looked confused and terrified. The board members studied the documents carefully. Their expressions grew harder and colder as they understood what had happened. When we finished the presentation, the chairman asked, "Who can explain these transactions?" Martin tried to defend himself, but his explanations made no sense. Every excuse he offered contradicted something in the documentation. Tyler tried to claim that he didn't understand what Martin had asked him to do. He said he was just following instructions. The board members didn't look sympathetic to his defense. I remained seated, expression unreadable. I didn't smile. I didn't show any satisfaction. I simply waited. The fallout was immediate and devastating. Martin's authority crumbled in the space of a few hours. He was summoned to the executive office to explain himself to corporate leadership. His office access was suspended. His executive privileges were revoked. Tyler lost his newly promoted leadership position. His access to company systems was frozen while the investigation continued. He looked devastated and confused, as if he couldn't understand how his life had changed so completely in just a few hours. The HR department froze all pending bonuses while they reviewed whether there had been any other financial irregularities in other departments. The office tension was electric. Employees whispered in the hallways, trying to understand what was happening. By that afternoon, security had escorted both Martin and Tyler out of the building. Martin looked angry and defeated. Tyler looked like he had been hit by a truck. They were gone before the end of business. My colleagues came to my desk throughout the day, asking if I knew what was happening. I told them honestly that I didn't know specific details, but that the board was investigating some financial irregularities. I recommended that everyone remain professional and let the company's leadership handle the situation. Nobody suspected that I had been involved in the investigation. Nobody realized that I had been the one collecting evidence behind the scenes. As far as everyone knew, the board had simply discovered the fraud through routine audit procedures. That evening, I received a call from Jessica in HR. She wanted to talk to me about a special opportunity. She couldn't say more over the phone, but she wanted me to come to an executive meeting the next morning. The next day, the company's founder returned to headquarters unexpectedly. My father, Charles Larkin, walked through the doors for the first time in 6 months. The staff whispered as he passed, "The old man's back." I saw him from a distance. He moved through the hallway with the same confident presence he had always carried. He didn't look retired at all. He looked powerful and focused. My heart raced. The moment I had been waiting for was finally arriving. But I wasn't ready to reveal myself yet. I wasn't ready to let everyone know that I was Charles Larkin's daughter. I wasn't ready to explain why I had been working undercover in my own company. I stayed at my desk and pretended to work. I avoided the hallways where my father was walking. I kept my head down and tried to be invisible. But I knew that soon, very soon, I would have to face him and explain everything. My father went directly to the executive conference room. The door closed behind him. Through the glass walls, I could see board members arriving for an emergency meeting. My father sat at the head of the table, listening carefully as people explained what had happened. I wondered what he was thinking. I wondered if he was disappointed that I hadn't told him the truth earlier. I wondered if he would understand why I had stayed quiet and handled this situation myself. That evening, my phone rang. It was my father. "Avery, I know you're at the company today," he said calmly. "I'd like to speak with you privately tomorrow morning. Come to my office at 8 o'clock. The time had come. Tomorrow, everything would change. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about what I was going to say to my father. I kept replaying everything that had happened since Martin removed me from the project. I kept wondering if I had done the right thing. But when morning came, I knew I had done the right thing. I had faced a situation that was fundamentally unjust, and I had responded with intelligence and integrity. I had protected the company. I had exposed the truth. I had done what needed to be done. I arrived at my father's office at 7:55. He was already there, standing by the window, looking out at the city. He turned when I entered, and for a moment, we just looked at each other. "Hello, Avery," he said calmly. "I believe we have a lot to discuss." I walked over and sat in the chair across from his desk. I told him everything. I told him about Martin removing me from the project. I told him about Tyler's incompetence. I told him about discovering the fraud. I explained how I had stayed quiet and collected evidence instead of reacting emotionally. I explained my strategy and my reasoning. I explained why I hadn't told him until the investigation was complete. My father listened to every word without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "You handled this exactly the way I taught you," he said. "You watched. You collected. You acted with precision." He stood and walked around the desk. He placed his hand on my shoulder. "You learned how to lead," he said softly. The board assembled for a full meeting that morning. This was the formal proceeding where Martin's actions would be officially addressed. I sat in the back row, observing, just as I had so many times before. Martin sat at a table facing the board members. He looked destroyed. His face was gray, and he seemed to have aged 10 years overnight. He tried to defend his actions, but his explanations were pathetic and transparent. He claimed that he had needed the money because of personal financial problems. He claimed that he had intended to pay it back eventually. He claimed that Tyler had been a willing participant who understood what was happening. Each claim was demolished by the evidence. Each excuse was contradicted by the documentation. Each attempt to minimize his crimes was exposed by the facts. Tyler sat beside him, looking sick. He kept saying that he didn't understand what he was doing. He kept blaming Martin for manipulating him. The board members showed no sympathy for his position. My father sat at the head of the board table, watching everything with a calm, measured expression. He didn't say much, but when he spoke, everyone listened. "This company was built on integrity," he said clearly. "Theft and fraud are not compatible with the values we represent." The board voted unanimously to terminate both Martin and Tyler effective immediately. Security would escort them out of the building. Their access to all company systems would be revoked. They would be banned from company property. More importantly, the board decided to involve law enforcement. The case would be turned over to the authorities for possible criminal prosecution. Martin and Tyler would face potential jail time for embezzlement. After the board meeting, my father asked me to meet him in the executive conference room. I walked in to find him sitting alone at the long table. He smiled when he saw me. "Avery, I want you to know how proud I am of you," he said. "You handled an extremely difficult situation with maturity and wisdom." I sat down across from him. "I couldn't let him steal from the company," I said simply. "I couldn't let him hurt my colleagues." "I know," my father replied. "And that's why I have a proposal for you." He explained that the board had voted unanimously to offer me a position as Chief Operations Officer. They wanted me to help lead the company moving forward. They recognized my intelligence, my integrity, and my commitment to the organization. He pulled out a formal letter offering me the position. The salary was more than triple what I had been making before. The responsibilities were enormous. But so was the opportunity. I thought about everything that had led to this moment. I thought about being removed from my project. I thought about being blamed publicly for failures I didn't commit. I thought about watching Martin steal from the company. But I also thought about staying calm when I wanted to scream. I thought about collecting evidence instead of acting emotionally. I thought about working strategically to expose the truth. "I accept," I said. My father smiled broadly. "Then welcome to leadership, my daughter." My first act as Chief Operations Officer was to reinstate fair leadership throughout the company. I worked with HR to rehire the employees who had been fired unfairly by Martin. I worked with the finance department to restore transparency to all company accounts. I promoted several employees who had been overlooked because of Martin's favoritism. I created new policies to ensure that decisions were made based on merit rather than personal relationships. I called a company-wide meeting to address what had happened. I didn't hide the facts. I explained clearly that the company had experienced fraud and that the perpetrators had been dealt with according to company policy. We don't rebuild power, I told the assembled employees. We rebuild people. We rebuild trust. We rebuild the integrity that makes this company special. I announced raises for employees who had been underpaid because of budget mismanagement. I announced new training programs and mentorship opportunities. I announced that leadership positions would be filled based on demonstrated ability rather than personal connections. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Employees who had felt demoralized and betrayed began to feel hope again. The company's culture shifted from one of fear and favoritism to one of fairness and opportunity. Claire became my deputy, managing special projects. Jessica expanded her role in HR to focus on employee development. Thomas received recognition and a substantial bonus for his years of loyal service. 6 months after I became Chief Operations Officer, the company's performance exceeded expectations. Productivity was up. Employee satisfaction was up. Client satisfaction was up. The company was thriving in ways it hadn't in years. The law enforcement investigation into Martin's activities concluded with criminal charges. He was prosecuted for embezzlement and fraud. He received a substantial prison sentence. His career was completely destroyed. Tyler's situation was more complicated. He received a lighter sentence because of his cooperation and because of evidence that he had been manipulated by Martin. He was released from prison after serving 2 years. His career in business was essentially over, though he managed to rebuild his life in other ways. The company recovered most of the stolen money through legal settlements. The financial hit was significant, but manageable. More importantly, the company's reputation was restored. Clients and partners had confidence that we operated with integrity and transparency. I was featured in several industry publications as an example of ethical leadership. Reporters wanted to know about my background and my path to success. I gave interviews, but I kept my focus on the company rather than on my personal story. A year after becoming Chief Operations Officer, I reflected on how far I had come. I thought about the woman who had stood in a glass conference room, being removed from her project without explanation. That woman felt like a different person now. I had learned that real power comes from patience and intelligence, not from anger or impatience. I had learned that sometimes the best response to injustice is to stay calm and collect evidence. I had learned that sometimes you have to wait for the right moment to act. Martin tried to start his own business after his release from prison, but it failed completely. His name was tainted by scandal. Nobody wanted to work with him. His reputation was destroyed permanently. He disappeared from the industry entirely. Tyler eventually found work at a small company in a different field. He was no longer in a position of leadership. He worked as an ordinary employee, doing work that other people supervised. He seemed to have learned humility, though I never spoke to him again after that fateful board meeting. The company went from strength to strength. Under my leadership, Larkin Dynamics expanded into new markets and developed new products. We became a model for ethical business practices in our industry. 1 year to the day after I became Chief Operations Officer, my father invited me to visit him at the family cabin in Montana. We sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. "I've been very proud of you," my father said softly. "You've done everything I hoped you."